Hello, everyone. Welcome to Programmers Week 2021. I hope you had chance to listen into some of the presentations from yesterday as well as earlier this morning. I'm pretty excited to be part of this learning journey. And today in this particular session, we're gonna talk about project metrics. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about risk-based testing in Agile implementation. There are no surprises, as the title suggests. That's the topic we're going to talk about. So sorry if I disappointed you all in that session. But my hope is to cover what is risk-based testing, why we perform risk-based testing, and what are some of the benefits of risk-based testing, and how can we put it into practice on any given, especially Agile methodology project. So let's dig in. Just to start with, just a little bit information about myself. I'm Ekta Panchal. I'm Principal Quality Engineer with Magenic Studios, Cognizant Softvision. Been here for 14 years. That's kind of my relevant experience. And yeah, soon to be eligible for driver's permit if in a year now. But that's just me. A little bit of experience. I have mainly been part of QE. Recently, since last couple of years, I'm also doing more of Scrum Master's role on a project, so it kind of gives me good perspective of the delivery and QE portion of the delivery. Now, going to just diving into our topic, what is risk, right? It's basically an event that may or may not occur and can potentially yield any negative impact. Risk, acknowledgement of risk is good, but it is not good enough, right? Especially on our projects and things like that. Yes, we acknowledge the risk, but we have to go a step further where we have to understand what is the impact of that risk, right? And that is something that we can identify by just knowing like how often this is going to happen, what is the probability of this is going to happen, and if it happens, then what is the impact of it? What are the consequences of it? Is it like it's going to result into revenue loss? Is it going to result into customers leaving your application? What is the impact of the risk? And that helps us quantify the risk. And once we have risk quantified, it just makes it easier to manage it, right? Then we have an understanding of the priority, what to focus on first. So that's a little bit what risk is. Now, in software development, there are various type of risks that we run into. We have, there are risks that as a team, project team, that we can manage. There are risks that are beyond our control, beyond our capacity to either manage or mitigate them. We could have a schedule risk that, I'm sure you all have run into projects where the release timeline is decided before we have started writing the code on the project, right? So some of those schedules come from the market need, where our client is and what they need to release by what time to either grab that market share or just have the revenue or whatever their business goals are, right, to support their business goals. There are budget risk, again, something that is not fully that can be owned by the team or managed by the team. This is mainly the stakeholders, like how much budget they have. That can change, because of some unknown reasons and things like that. So, oops, sorry about that. So yeah, there are various type of risk on a software delivery project. There are technical risk. We end up selecting a technology that may not support future requirements of the client. That's a risk, right? So many different type of risk. As I said, some that can be managed by the team, mitigated by the team, and some that is beyond the team's control. Now, after having all this risk as a tester, what kind of risk that we um, we face on day-to-day basis, right? Just from our delivery perspective to perform our testing activities. Uh, these are just something I'm sure you all have run into this at some point in some or the other project where the code is not being delivered to us on time, so we don't have enough time to uh, test our complete our testing. We don't have environment stability, so even if the code is available, the environment is not stable enough allowing us to test what we want to test, or the code is just poor quality. There are just too many bugs, and that just increases our time and effort and energy that we spend into testing something. uh, we don't have requirements that are clear enough, or it is understood well enough by dev and QA both, and that leads into m- uh, gap in our understanding, and um, leading into false bugs. Inadequate staffing, when it comes to budget, QA is the one that actually, being probably take the most hit, because you know we it's testing is something that happens in the end of the project, and we don't have sufficient QE team members to complete all of the testing, but we need developers to generate the code. So that's where there are some decisions that are being made, and that's something that hit with QE takes. And last but not the least, fixed release date, where the release timeline is there without understanding what does it take to actually get there to release, right? Um, so those are just some of the risks that we as testers run into on our day-to-day life, or in most of our projects and engagements. Know, uh, so now coming to what is risk-based testing. Risk-based testing, as it suggests, it is the testing that is done in accordance with the risk, right? You identify the risk. We talked about how you can quantify the risk. And once we have quantified the risk, let's test what is the highest risk, right? However, it's also a thought process where you want to apply that thought process in every single testing activity that you perform, whether it is requirement analysis, test development, test execution, or whatever that we are doing to deliver the software product. So it's more of a thought process. It is a tool to better manage testing activities, so that we can be informed as a QE team, and we can keep our stakeholders informed as well. And we can contribute in providing the right information at the right time to make the decisions. Now, once we have understood what risk-based testing is, and there is a lot more that goes into risk-based testing, right? Especially once we have understood the concept, how to put it into practice, and how can we make sure that we can consistently follow this practice project after project after project, right? We will get into it, but just let's talk about why we want to perform risk-based testing, and why we do not want to um, go ahead and just test traditionally, right? Which would be basically, okay, we have requirements, we wrote the test cases, we're gonna go ahead and execute all of the test cases. Once they are all executed, that's when we go and say, okay, we're done, we are happy, you are happy, the world is la la land, right? So why we want to perform risk-based testing is, it is good value for your money. your money or your client's money. It allows you to address the highest risk first and hence provides you the most value the client has spent on us till date. We want to perform risk-based testing because testing is never enough. You could keep testing a product as long as you want, but do we really want to do that? Right? We could keep finding bugs because our software is bug-free is a myth, right? So testing is complete or bug-free code. Both of them are just a myth. And after some point, we hit law of diminishing returns. We test more and more, but it does not yield the results. And some point, it's just going to yield us negative results, right? So these are the reasons why we want to perform risk-based testing. And this is something that we can do on any project, right? It doesn't have to be an agile project. It can be on a waterfall project. Now, these days, I doubt there are many companies that follow that methodology of software development. But even if they were, like, this is something that we can still follow on any methodology that we use to develop the software. However, when it comes to agile development, risk-based testing is the perfect match. The reason why it is perfect match is because if you see the both agile development and risk-based testing kind of go hand in hand, as in if for agile development, from product owner, product management perspective, what we look at is minimal viable product. That's the first thing that we want to get to the market. It has to be valuable, and that's our small chunk of the product that we can put it into the market and maybe monetize it, right? And then as we have identified minimal viable product, we keep iterating through our backlog. We keep adding more stuff to our backlog, and we constantly keep shuffling our backlog so that we can always tackle the highest priority stuff. Again, it's not always from the business perspective. The highest priority could also be from technical perspective, but that's the whole idea of agile development. You have a priority of the things that you need to work on. And same thing for risk-based testing. Risk-based testing is done in the order of business priority. It does take into consideration technical prioritization because there are times you have to pay attention to your technical debt, or you have to pay attention to anything that would help the software development maybe in future, right? Or it might just make it more maintainable, or it might make it more scalable. So from all those perspectives, yes, risk-based testing has to be done in technical accordance as well. But our basic notion is to stay in tandem with our business priority. It helps us to manage the scope of testing. Just like how in agile development, prioritization of backlog would help manage the scope for the development or scope for the product release. Risk-based testing allows us to do that same thing for testing scope, which is why it just makes perfect sense to follow risk-based testing approach on any agile project. Now, once we, this is once we have decided that we're going to follow risk-based testing approach on our project, we also need to understand that what is that we want to accomplish, right? What is the result of testing? What are we looking at? Is the result of testing your test scripts, the artifacts that you create during the process of testing? Is the result of testing bugs? Or is the result of testing is your proof of quality or proof of your effort that, okay, we have executed so many test cases and here are the results. All of these things are definitely outcome of our sales testing activities. However, the main goal of our testing is to provide information, right? We as testers, or we as QE people, we definitely find, what are the issues with the code and what could be the potential improvements even, right? Sometimes we look into our code and we say, okay, maybe it would be done better this way. Maybe there is no consistency in error messages. So we help them better the code, but at the end of the day, goal or outcome of our testing is information, whether it is that information is for our developers, that information is for our um, stakeholders, anybody, right? And more than gatekeepers, we are the information providers. And this is the information that allows our stakeholders to make the right decisions, or if there is something wrong that's going on, it allows them to take any preventive and corrective actions. So result of testing is information. Now, coming to testing activities, this is just typically a sprint, right? In any whatever agile project and whatever cadence we are following in any agile development project, whether it is a 2-week sprint, 3-week sprint, or a 4-week iteration, whether we are doing in-sprint testing, we are lagging sprint testing, or we are doing testing on a 3-week sprint in the last week of the sprint, whatever is our cadence from the software delivery perspective, whether we are releasing every 2 weeks, every quarter, every 6 months, whatever the cadence may be, our testing activities in general just remains the same. We do the requirements review. Once we have reviewed the requirements, we identify what to test. Once we have identified what to test, we go ahead and detail out those test cases while our developers are developing the code. And then we execute those tests, we file the bug reports, triage them, and we just follow the same process again, right? This is our standard testing activities. Now, let's look at how in all of these testing activities, we can apply our risk-based testing approach, and we can apply some of the practices that we can follow project after project. It's something that just kind of a framework, right? Okay, so the first thing is requirements review. On a project where you go, you are, most of the times QE is brought in, at least QE lead is brought in sprint 0, but a lot of testers on the project are brought in maybe after a couple of sprints, right? After developers have built some code. And then we assign those user stories to the testers to test. Now, when you get into that position, what is the first thing that you do? Do you just look at the user story, its acceptance criteria, and start writing the test? If that's what you are doing, then maybe you need to step back. You need to step back and ask the questions to whoever, right? Whether it is your BA, product owner, product manager, or your team members. You ask the question, what is that we are doing and why are we doing it? Why are we building this software? Why are we building this product for our client? And when we ask that, when we understand the why behind the decision of building a product, that's when we understand the scope. That is what something that allows us to understand the risk should it come, right? It is not always tied to late code delivery and things like that. That is definitely a delivery risk. But once we understand the bigger picture of the basic need of developing a software, that's when we can analyze our requirements in that context. That's when we can identify the gaps in the requirements. And that's when we can identify the risk. Well, so we should always look at the big picture, stop and ask the right questions to understand why. Why are we building this product? Is this something that client is trying to grab a market share, or is it something that could also be like, okay, client already had a product in market, but it is not meeting certain compliances, and hence client probably wants to avoid lawsuits, and that's why we are working on this project, right? So every context has a different risk association with it, and that's why it is important for us to understand that bigger picture. Now, once we have understood that bigger picture and we carry that knowledge during our requirement analysis, during our acceptance criteria review and everything for every story, now that knowledge we use in terms of our test scenario identification. When we are identifying test scenarios for our user story, or if you are following use cases, whatever that basically is your requirement artifact. Once we start identifying those test scenarios, we have to assign them priority. And this prioritization of test scenario is extremely important and is the core thing from risk-based testing perspective. What this does is this allows you to rank, just like how your backlog is ranked for the requirements, it is stack ranked, allowing this priority to your test scenarios, to your test cases, allow you to stack rank all of your tests and allow you to compare and contrast in terms of business priority, which one would take precedence over other. So this is the core piece of risk-based testing. And once you have identified this priority, and once you have assigned all this priority, now you want to take this back to your core team. Your core team is your VA, your PO, your tech lead, or developer who is working on that specific user story, or the architect. And when you take it back to them and you review this test coverage, that for this user story, I have X number of test scenarios identified, and here is what I understand the priority is, and hence what what do you think in terms of those prioritization? Do you think this priority is correct, not correct? If they have any feedback, but that's what you want to do. This is something that I've just put kind of a metric. How would you prioritize your test cases, right? You want to definitely look at business risk, but you also want to look at the technical risk of your test scenarios, the technical risk that it might be exercising, or if you had a bug on that particular, if that particular test failed, and what kind of regression that it could cause, or what kind of code fixes it can cause. So, and what are the things that might be associated with it that would lead you to do more regression, or that could potentially lead to regression bugs. So keeping in mind business risk and technical risk, you can analyze, or you can assign the priority of your test scenarios. Once you have identified test scenarios and prioritized, now it's time to go ahead and do test development, right? And when we are doing test development, again, we can go in the order of priority. We have 50 test scenarios identified for, say, 5 user stories. What we want to do is we want to detail out all of the P1, P2 across all the 5 user stories first, because those are the tests that you want to execute first. And hence, it is, if just in case, if you were to run out of time, you don't want to have tests from user story 1 and 2, all of the P1, P2, P3, P4 test identified, but for the rest of the 3 user stories, you don't have any test detailed out. So just to go in the order of priority, just to go in the order of risk, you want to first detail out your P1 and P2 across all the 5 user stories before you move to P3 and P4. When we are testing, we should also consider API and UI tests. If most of the business logic is in API, that does take precedence over your UI tests. You want to prioritize API tests, and it's, whether you are automating them or whether you are just testing it through Swagger or Postman, whatever the case may be, you want to prioritize that testing so that not only QA team benefits, right? QA team is aware, okay, fine, this API is not working, but if the developer is working on the UI and consuming those APIs, they are also well aware of it, and hence, it can be fixed sooner before the bug gets into QA environment. From the test automation perspective, again, this is most of the projects we do test automation in sprint test automation for all of our sprint deliveries. But even then, if you are running out of time and if you have to do test automation maybe later in the sprint or next sprint, you want to generate your test automation backlog based on the priority of your test cases so that you are always automating in the right order of priority. Another core thing that risk-based testing should always follow is establishing the traceability with feature and functional grouping. You have to have an understanding, a way of trace that out of my 500 test cases, my 100 test cases are for feature one, my 200 test cases are for feature two, and another 50 test cases for feature three or whatever, likewise. But you have to have that traceability where you can go and find out how many tests do I have for this feature? Not essentially for the user story. A feature could be having multiple user stories, but from a functional grouping perspective, from a product perspective, what are the tests that are associated with this particular functionality of the product? And from test case development perspective, I would also say that, on typical engagement, if it is a 6-month engagement, you probably wouldn't do this. But if the engagements are lasting maybe a year or 2 years or even longer, right? I mean, there are products that we are releasing one release, second release, third release. For all of those products or for all of those engagements, you want to have discipline to obsolete your test, because something that you developed, the test cases that you developed a year ago, you probably don't need to exercise them over and over again now, right? You can go ahead and obsolete some of this test because it is already been covered somewhere else, or if the product is very, very stable after 1 year in that particular area, you don't need to run those tests, individual tests, right? Like tests that we create at the time of user story development. We could always integrate those tests as part of our regression testing or build our end-to-end test and cover that functionality that way, but we don't have to keep having those modular tests. So that's just a little bit of discipline that we should follow. And again, this is not only in risk-based testing, this is anywhere, right? If you want to obsolete the old test cases, if they don't yield value after running them over and over again. In terms of test execution, again, this is something, our focus, right? When we are testing in sprint or legging sprint, whatever, whenever we get code to test, our focus should be providing feedback to developers the first. That should be, when we do that, then we can not only allow developers to fix those bugs faster, we can allow ourselves to reduce the testing debt, because otherwise what's going to happen is we have executed tests, we identified the bug, however, its communication is delayed, and that's when the developers have moved on to something else. The context switch has already happened. By the time they come back to the bug and they fix the bug, we have moved on to something else. So it is just like, our focus in agile development should always be providing feedback. Anything that we have available for testing, we should test it first before we move on to any other activity, right? That should be our focus, because we want to have that feedback loop constantly going on with the developers. It cannot happen just once a week or in 2 week sprint. It cannot happen on third or last 2 days of the sprint or last 3 days of the sprint. And also in terms of our test automation, if you have most of your tests automated and if you are running a nightly regression, you want to have that level of an understanding. My nightly test have passed, failed, what has failed. If you have like 10 tests failed out of 100 in your nightly automation run, are those 10 tests priority one? Is any of them is priority one or priority two? And if that is the case, you want to look at those tests first before you go and investigate any other test. So that is just in test execution. You always follow the priority of providing the feedback first. And once you have provided the feedback, you want to keep executing your test in the order of priority. Another thing in terms of test execution, there are many applications that we build these days are all um, responsive applications. So even if we are not building it for a specific mobile technology, we build responsive application and hence the testing effort for those multifolds, right? We have to cover browsers and operating systems for multiple combinations. And in this case, again, we can follow the same risk-based approach. We can work with the client, we can work with the stakeholders to understand what is the user basis, what is the highest priority of combination, which device they are going to target first, or if their user base is from, or which operating system their user base is, and identify those high priority combinations or high priority browsers or devices, and then rate it against your test cases such that you can, as it is shown here, you can come up with some sort of a metrics where you execute all of your P1 across all of the identified browser and devices, but you run your P2 only to some of them, P3 only to the highest priority, and P4 only through highest priority, right? What this does is this helps you manage the scope of your testing. So in this case, if you were to have two test cases in each of the categories, right? If P1 had two test cases, P2 had two test cases, and likewise, if you did not have this understanding developed with your stakeholders that this is how we as QA going to embark on device and browser testing, you would end up for every single test, you would end up executing them on every single browser and OS combination. For 8 tests, it would result into your 32 test executions, versus if you have gone and established this understanding and established this pattern, risk-based testing pattern for your coverage, you are just doing 14 test executions, right? So that's where you are saving time, but at the same time, you are providing value. You are providing broader coverage um, without much of compromising the quality, right? And other thing in risk-based testing, or not so much from risk-based testing perspective, but just in any agile development project, how we keep track of the velocity of the team. We also want to keep track of our test execution velocity, how much test we as a team can execute in a given day, right? Again, this is something that can be difficult to arrive at if we are doing in-sprint testing and your focus is constantly changing between requirements review, test development, test scenario identification, or test execution. However, you want to, over a period of time, you want to arrive at a test execution velocity, have this information with you available so that any given time when you're hitting stabilization period, or when you are asked to do, okay, we changed something, middle layer, and now we have to do the regression testing, you can provide an understanding is how much it is going to test, or what is going to the testing that we are going to carry forward, right? So that's on test execution with risk-based testing approach. Now, bug reporting and triage. As we execute tests, we definitely love to uh, not find bugs, but we definitely take pride when we uncover the bug and we log them. We, get it prioritized. We triage those bugs, get it prioritized by product owner and product manager. With the bugs, also, we want to follow the same traceability that we follow for test cases. not only want to trace the bug to test cases alone, but we want to have the bugs traceability with feature and functional grouping, so we can analyze which feature has most bug density, right? So come the release time, we know where to focus our regression testing effort more, or the development team is aware about where they need to focus more in terms of, you know, scrutinizing their code, right? So we want to establish that traceability, just like with our test cases, bugs should also follow that. And every bug should have severity, priority, environment, root cause, all of those things recorded. It is important, when you start collecting these pieces of information over a period of time, you might uncover that because of your environmental issues or because of your test data issues, it contributed 20% to your bugs. That's not the code quality. That is something we need to work on our infrastructure, and something that we need to stabilize those things, right? So unless you have started capturing this information, you will not be able to generate, or you will not be able to look into, any need for improvements. um, Another thing, I just mentioned, we should always prioritize bugs and use product owner, product manager uh, to help us prioritize these bugs in accordance with the release or in accordance with the product that we are going to release. But at the same time, each bug should be story pointed too. The reason why story pointing bug is important, especially in agile development, is because now, along with your user story backlog, which could be, maybe you have 150 points of user stories to develop, and in 3 sprints, but you also have 50 points of bug backlog. So that kind of adds that, that gives you a perspective of how much of total work the team has. And hence, it is important to story point the bugs as well. So that does take care of all of these activities and how we could put risk-based testing approach in practice. This is something that, as I said, it's more like a framework. You can apply these concepts on any project, whether it is 2-week sprint, whether it is safe UIDV PI planning, whatever the case may be. It helps in your planning, it helps in your execution, or just overall delivery of the project. Now, having said that, some of the benefits, right? After following risk-based testing practices, or following this approach on projects, some of the benefits that we get out of it is just the information, right? We talked about earlier that result of testing or outcome of testing is information. What kind of information are we providing? Right? If we were not following a risk-based testing approach, the information at the end of the sprint we can provide is we have developed 50 new test cases in current sprint. However, if we are following risk-based testing approach, our information can be, okay, out of 50, test cases, here are my priority 1 and priority 2 test cases. Now, since we are following test coverage reviews and we are doing those test coverage reviews every sprint, for every user story, as a team, we all have a collective understanding of what is that coverage means. When we talk about that P1 and P2 out of 50 tests, we have like 25 of them are P1 and P2 test cases. There is a shared understanding because of test coverage reviews that what does those P1 and P2 mean, right? And how much of risk that it covers for. So there is a shared understanding about it. In terms of automation coverage, if you were not following it, what you could say is, out of my 100 test cases or out of my 50 test cases, 25 of them have been automated. But if you were following these practices where you are prioritizing your test cases, what you are telling, the story you are telling is, oh, out of 50 test cases, I have automated all of my P1 test cases, or I have automated my 87% of P2 test cases or whatever it is. It just gives the perspective and additional information and fosters the trust in QA team even more by the stakeholders that, okay, we are doing everything in accordance of priority. If I have 100% of P1 automated, that means I am getting feedback on anything that is the highest risk set, right? It is like we can say, okay, for feature one, I have 50% of test automation already done, but for feature two, I'm at 20%, right? It starts a conversation why that's the case. Why are we focusing only on feature one, or why not feature two, and things like that. It just helps you have those conversations and provides the project team, or beyond the project team, some of the context that may be helpful. Same thing for test execution results, right? We don't want to provide this pie chart by saying, okay, out of this, whatever test execution that QA team had planned, this is where we are at, right? Your pass rate is 80%, but what does that 80% pass rate mean? That 80% pass rate could still mean that we have very high priority bugs in our backlog. So what risk-based testing approach allows us to do is, okay, out of my 80% pass rate, I have 20% and 20% failure. I still have 15% of tests that are failed that are P1 test cases, right? Now that alarm goes off, right? Otherwise, 80% 80% pass rate is something that people are gonna feel happy about. That, oh, we have 80% test pass, but when you look it under the hood, that P1 tests are failing, then that just helps you get attention to it. Same thing for release readiness. It is, if we were not following this approach, and if we were, remember I mentioned that you want to keep track of your test execution velocity. And when we do that, we can forecast our test executions. Without that, we are told, okay, releases in 2 weeks. 2 weeks are your stabilization period. And the Q lead goes, oh, we have 500 test cases. And, we started it. We are on day 5. We are 50% done. But that still does not tell the risk. It says where you are at in your status or in your activity status, but that does not provide context to the stakeholders, saying that out of those 50%, what is that you have covered so far? Am I okay to release this feature? And if there is another feature that might be more bug dense, can I have conversations of not releasing that feature? So following risk-based testing approach allows us to provide that level of information. Before even we get into our regression testing, before we even start doing regression testing, we can tell them that, okay, given 2 weeks, I have X number of tests planned out for test execution, and hence I won't be able to complete all of this P3, P4s, right? Because there's just no time. And when we started testing, we have enough time to go through all of this test, but guess what? We ran into so many high priority bugs. Now with the bug life cycle, how long it takes for you to get those bugs back, we will run out of time before we can even hit P3, right? So following this approach helps you provide some of the information that has more richness to it, and helps stakeholders make better decisions, or any actions that they need to take. That's pretty much it. I think we are almost at time for this presentation, but if there are any question and answer, please feel free to post them in the chat.
I don't see any questions for now. A lot of good reactions though.
That's good to know. Okay. Maybe I explained everything so perfectly, no questions. Or maybe I did such a terrible job that it just went everybody's head. Okay. But if
No,
there are
I'm
no
sure it's a
questions.
perception.
Okay. Thank you. In that case, do we do a wrap?
Yes, we can wrap up.
Okie dokie. Thank you, everyone.